Addiction is often seen as a failure of willpower, but what if it's actually a deeper psychological and spiritual crisis? Carl Jung and Dr. Gabor Maté, two towering figures in psychology, offer profound insights into the true nature of addiction. Jung viewed addiction as a misguided search for transcendence, while Maté connects it to unresolved childhood trauma and emotional pain. By exploring their perspectives, we can uncover a more compassionate and transformative understanding of addiction, one that moves beyond shame and toward healing. Addiction is often seen as a failure of willpower, but Carl Jung's perspective on addiction runs deeper. To him, addiction is not merely a bad habit or a moral failing. It's a profound spiritual crisis, a desperate search for meaning in a world that feels empty. Jung believed that the addict is someone who is seeking transcendence, but is misguided in their pursuit. Instead of addressing the deeper, unconscious desires for spiritual fulfillment and self-realization, they turn to substances or behaviors to numb the pain. In essence, addiction is the symptom of an underlying problem, a desperate attempt to fill a spiritual void that cannot be satisfied by worldly distractions. Jung's personal experience with addiction, especially through his correspondence with Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, highlights the importance of spiritual awakening in overcoming addiction. In his letters to Wilson, Jung emphasized that true recovery could only occur if the addict found a deeper, transcendent purpose. He suggested that AA's approach, centering on the idea of surrendering to a higher power, could be effective because it encouraged individuals to confront their spiritual emptiness and replace the craving for substances with the longing for a more profound connection to life. But Jung was not only concerned with the religious aspect of addiction. He also understood that individuals were often addicted to certain thought patterns or behavior. For Jung, addiction was both a symptom and an expression of the individual's inner conflict, an attempt to reconcile the opposing forces of the conscious and unconscious mind. Jung frequently used the concept of the shadow to describe the repressed parts of the psyche, which often manifest in destructive ways, like addiction. If someone has unresolved emotional pain or deep-seated fears, they may be drawn to substances as a form of avoidance. However, this only perpetuates the cycle of addiction, as the shadow remains hidden and continues to exert its influence. Addiction, according to Jung, is also tied to an individual's process of individuation, the psychological journey toward wholeness. When people are unable to confront their darker aspects or embrace their true selves, they may seek comfort in addictions, which provide temporary relief but ultimately prevent true healing. Jung believed that the key to recovery was not simply abstaining from substances, but fully confronting the parts of the self that led to the addictive behavior in the first place. This involves self-reflection, deep psychological work, and finding a greater sense of purpose, meaning, and inner peace. Jung's understanding of addiction was rooted in his broader view of psychology as a process of integration. He saw healing not as a return to normalcy, but as a journey toward authenticity and psychological wholeness. This transformation requires an individual to confront their most uncomfortable emotions, acknowledge their wounds, and ultimately make peace with them. Addiction is not something to be ashamed of or simply overcome. It is a call to awaken to a deeper truth about oneself and the world. Gabor Maté, a renowned physician and addiction specialist, also approaches addiction with a depth of compassion and insight that extends beyond the surface behavior. Maté's work is heavily influenced by the idea that addiction is not merely a coping mechanism or a product of choice. It is a response to unresolved trauma. According to Maté, addiction stems from a place of deep emotional pain and a need to numb or escape that pain. Whether it's substances like alcohol, drugs, food, or behaviors like gambling, sex, or even work, the addictive process is ultimately a way of self-medicating to cope with emotional wounds that have not been properly addressed. Maté's groundbreaking work highlights the fact that the majority of individuals who struggle with addiction have experienced some form of childhood trauma, neglect, or emotional distress. These early experiences shape the brain in ways that influence behavior throughout adulthood. Children who grow up in environments where their emotional needs are not met, whether due to neglect, abuse, or simply the absence of loving, attentive care, develop coping mechanisms that can manifest as addictive behaviors later in life. For Maté, addiction is a symptom of a deeper need for connection, care, and emotional regulation that was missing in childhood. The behavior itself is secondary to the underlying emotional wounds. What's remarkable about Maté's perspective is that it challenges the commonly held notion that addiction is simply a moral failing or a lack of willpower. He stresses that addiction is not a matter of making poor choices. It is an attempt to soothe the pain that is often buried so deep in the unconscious that it's difficult to even acknowledge. This trauma is not necessarily something as overt as physical abuse. It could also be emotional neglect, the absence of secure attachment, or simply a lack of validation or nurturing in the formative years. Maté emphasizes that healing from addiction is not about simply stopping the addictive behavior. True healing occurs when an individual can address the trauma at its roots, often with the help of therapeutic interventions, mindfulness practices, and self-reflection. The journey toward recovery is one of self-compassion, learning to recognize and treat the emotional wounds with kindness and understanding, rather than with judgment and guilt. Maté's holistic approach to addiction involves seeing the person behind the addiction, recognizing their human need for connection, love, and understanding, and providing the space for that healing to unfold. In his work, Maté also addresses the societal factors that contribute to addiction. He argues that modern society, with its focus on productivity, material success, and superficial connections, exacerbates the disconnection people feel from their true selves. Addiction, in many ways, is a reaction to the alienation and emotional fragmentation that permeate contemporary life. When individuals feel disconnected from their purpose, their community, and their own emotional needs, they turn to substances or behaviors to fill the void. Maté's work reminds us that addiction is not simply a personal problem, it is a societal one, and healing can only occur when both the individual and the larger culture shift toward greater emotional awareness and connection. Ultimately, Maté's approach to addiction is one of compassion and understanding, recognizing the complexity of the human experience and the deep emotional wounds that often lie at the root of addictive behavior. He believes that healing from addiction requires a return to emotional authenticity and the courage to face the pain that has been buried for so long. It is only by acknowledging this pain and developing healthier ways to cope with it that true recovery can be achieved. Understanding addiction through the lens of neuroscience adds a crucial layer to the psychological and emotional factors at play. The addict's brain is not merely misbehaving or out of control. It is physically and chemically altered by the repetitive cycles of substance use. Addiction has long been tied to the brain's reward system, specifically the dopamine pathways, which are responsible for feelings of pleasure and satisfaction. Every time an addict engages in the behavior, whether it's drinking, using drugs, or gambling, the brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter that signals pleasure and reinforcement. This flood of dopamine reinforces the behavior, making it more likely that the individual will engage in the same action again to achieve that same rush of gratification. Over time, the brain becomes desensitized to this dopamine release, and the individual needs increasing amounts of the substance or behavior to achieve the same effect. This is the hallmark of addiction, a progressive need for more of the substance to feel normal or to experience pleasure. This biochemical cycle has profound implications for understanding why addiction is so difficult to break. The brain, over time, becomes rewired to prioritize the addictive behavior above other activities, even those that once brought pleasure or fulfillment. The brain's reward system grows more attuned to the addictive substance, and normal, healthy activities like eating, exercising, or socializing take a back seat. This is why many people struggling with addiction feel as though they have lost control. They no longer have the ability to make rational decisions about their behavior because their brain is constantly driving them toward the substance. Moreover, addiction is closely tied to stress regulation. In addition to dopamine, the brain also releases cortisol, the stress hormone, in response to emotional or physical stress. For those with an addiction, their ability to manage stress is often compromised. Their brains become conditioned to view substances or behaviors as a way to cope with anxiety, sadness, or frustration. This is why addicts often describe their cravings as a way to self-medicate or escape from emotional discomfort. The brain learns that substances provide relief from these negative feelings, creating a vicious cycle where the stressors of life trigger cravings, which in turn are temporarily soothed by the addictive behavior. Interestingly, the brain's structure and chemistry can also be influenced by childhood experiences, particularly trauma. Research on adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, has shown that individuals who experience neglect, abuse, or significant emotional upheaval during their formative years are more likely to develop addiction later in life. These early experiences affect the brain's development in profound ways, particularly areas involved in emotional regulation, impulse control, and the ability to form healthy attachments. Children who grow up in chaotic, stressful environments may have a hyper-responsive stress system that remains activated throughout their life, making them more vulnerable to addiction when they encounter stress in adulthood. Additionally, the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for executive functions like decision-making, impulse control, and planning, becomes impaired in those with addiction. This impairment explains why many addicts engage in self-destructive behavior despite knowing the negative consequences. The prefrontal cortex is essentially hijacked by the brain's reward system, which has become focused on immediate gratification and short-term relief, often at the expense of long-term well-being. The lack of impulse control and foresight makes it much harder to resist the temptation of addiction, even if the individual consciously wants to quit. While understanding the brain's chemistry and structure is essential, it's also crucial to examine the psychological factors that contribute to addiction. For many people, addiction is not just a matter of pleasure-seeking. It's a way to cope with unresolved emotional pain, trauma, and psychological wounds. The brain's reward system becomes a tool of survival, helping the individual numb or distract from feelings of loneliness, depression, anxiety, or past trauma. However, the more an addict turns to substances or behaviors for relief, the more entrenched their addiction becomes. The brain adapts, and the neural pathways that once supported healthy coping mechanisms become overshadowed by the addictive pathways. The brain essentially rewires itself to prioritize addiction over everything else, further reinforcing the cycle. Another aspect of addiction that science has uncovered is the role of genetics. Studies have shown that there is a genetic predisposition to addiction, meaning that some people may be more susceptible to developing addictive behaviors due to their genetic makeup. However, genetics alone is not destiny. Environmental factors such as childhood trauma, socioeconomic status, and social connections can also influence whether someone will develop an addiction. In other words, genetics may make a person more vulnerable to addiction, but it is the environment and the way an individual learns to cope with stress and emotional pain that ultimately shapes whether or not they will engage in addictive behaviors. The science of addiction also underscores the importance of understanding addiction as a multifaceted problem that requires more than just a one-size-fits-all solution. The brain's neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire and change over time, gives hope for recovery. While addiction rewires the brain in unhealthy ways, it is also possible for the brain to be rewired through therapeutic interventions, mindfulness practices, and other healing modalities. Recovery is not about returning to a pre-addiction state. It's about creating new neural pathways that support healthier, more adaptive behaviors. This process takes time, patience, and effort, but the brain's capacity for change is remarkable. Furthermore, the addictive cycle can be interrupted by fostering emotional awareness, mindfulness, and self-regulation. For many addicts, the key to breaking free from the cycle is learning how to manage the emotions that drive their cravings in the first place. Instead of turning to substances to cope with feelings of stress, anxiety, or depression, individuals can learn to acknowledge and process those emotions in healthier ways. This requires creating new coping mechanisms, building emotional resilience, and developing a greater sense of self-compassion. The science of addiction also points to the importance of social and community support. The brain's reward system is highly influenced by social connections. When people feel isolated or disconnected, they are more vulnerable to addiction. On the other hand, positive social interactions and a sense of belonging can help counteract the brain's cravings for addictive substances. Support groups, therapy, and meaningful relationships provide the emotional nourishment that addicts often seek in unhealthy ways. Through social connections, addicts can begin to heal from the deep emotional wounds that often fuel their addiction, and they can learn healthier ways of coping with stress and emotional pain. Ultimately, understanding the science of addiction is crucial to developing effective treatment approaches. Addiction is not a simple matter of willpower. It is a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. Recovery requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the brain's chemistry, the individual's emotional pain, and the environmental factors that contribute to addiction. With the right tools, support, and understanding, individuals can break free from the cycle of addiction and begin to heal on a deeper level. Healing from addiction is not simply about removing the addictive substance or behavior from one's life. It is about addressing the root causes that led to the addiction in the first place. Without addressing the underlying pain, trauma, or psychological wounds, the addictive cycle often continues in other forms. People who stop using substances but do not engage in deeper healing may find themselves developing other compulsive behaviors, such as workaholism, excessive social media use, or unhealthy relationships. True recovery requires a transformation of the self, a process that involves both psychological and spiritual growth. Carl Jung believed that addiction could not be treated solely by external means, such as medication or behavioral therapy. He saw addiction as a crisis of the soul, a sign that the individual was disconnected from their true self. The addict's longing for escape, he argued, was actually a deeper yearning for wholeness and meaning. In his famous correspondence with Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Jung suggested that the only way to truly overcome addiction was through a spiritual awakening, an experience that reconnects the individual with something greater than themselves. This does not necessarily mean religion in the traditional sense, but rather an inner transformation that brings a renewed sense of purpose and belonging. Spiritual awakening, in Jung's view, is not about adhering to dogma or rituals, but about a deep personal realization of one's place in the world. Addicts, he believed, often turn to substances as a misguided attempt at transcendence. The temporary euphoria of drugs or alcohol mimics the feeling of connection to something greater. But because it is artificial, it ultimately leads to despair. True healing, Jung argued, occurs when an individual finds genuine meaning, whether through creativity, relationships, nature, or self-exploration. This process requires deep introspection, facing one's shadow, and integrating the repressed aspects of the psyche that have been fueling the addiction. Gabor Maté builds on this idea, but approaches it from a more psychological and trauma-informed perspective. According to Maté, addiction is fundamentally a response to pain, and true healing involves learning to sit with that pain rather than escaping from it. He argues that most people with addiction have experienced significant childhood trauma or emotional neglect, leading them to develop coping mechanisms that revolve around numbing their emotions. In order to heal, addicts must learn to face their wounds with compassion and curiosity, rather than avoidance and self-judgment. Maté emphasizes that healing is not about forcing oneself to stop an addictive behavior, but about understanding why that behavior exists in the first place. He encourages individuals to ask themselves, what pain am I trying to numb? What emotions am I afraid to feel? What unmet needs from my childhood am I trying to fulfill through my addiction? By answering these questions honestly, individuals can begin to address the real issues that are driving their compulsions. One of Maté's key insights is that addiction is rooted in a lack of self-compassion. Many addicts carry deep shame, believing that their behavior is a personal failing rather than a response to past wounds. This shame creates a vicious cycle. The more they judge themselves for their addiction, the more pain they feel, and the more they turn to their addiction for relief. Healing, therefore, involves breaking this cycle by replacing shame with self-understanding. Instead of viewing addiction as something to be ashamed of, Maté encourages individuals to see it as a coping mechanism that developed in response to difficult circumstances. The goal is not to fight the addiction, but to heal the underlying wounds so that the addiction no longer serves a purpose. Another essential component of healing is reconnecting with the body. Many addicts have a fractured relationship with their physical selves, as addiction often involves dissociation, a disconnection from bodily sensations and emotions. Practices such as meditation, breathwork, yoga, and somatic therapy can help individuals become more attuned to their bodies and emotions, making it easier to sit with discomfort rather than numbing it. These practices also help regulate the nervous system, which is often in a state of chronic stress or hyperarousal due to past trauma. Community and connection are also vital for healing. Both Jung and Maté emphasize the importance of relationships in overcoming addiction. Jung believed that human beings have an innate need for connection, and when that need is unmet, it manifests in destructive ways. Maté similarly argues that addiction is often a symptom of isolation, and that meaningful relationships are one of the most powerful antidotes. This is why support groups like Alcoholics Anonymous have been so effective, not because of the specific steps, but because they provide a sense of belonging and understanding. Being in a space where one's struggles are recognized and validated can be incredibly healing. healing also involves creating new narratives about oneself. Many addicts carry limiting beliefs such as, "I am broken," "I am unworthy," or "I will never change." These beliefs, often formed in childhood, keep them trapped in destructive cycles. A crucial part of recovery is identifying these beliefs and actively rewriting them. Therapy, journaling, and self-reflection can help individuals recognize the negative stories they tell themselves and replace them with narratives of growth and resilience. Instead of seeing themselves as broken, they can begin to see themselves as individuals on a healing journey. An important but often overlooked aspect of recovery is finding new sources of joy and meaning. Addiction often provides a sense of excitement, escape, or relief from boredom, and when it is removed, individuals can feel lost or empty. This is why recovery must involve not only removing the addiction, but also finding new passions and pursuits that bring fulfillment. Whether it's art, music, nature, spirituality, or helping others, finding new ways to experience joy and purpose is crucial for long-term healing. Ultimately, healing from addiction is not just about abstaining from substances or behaviors. It is about transforming the way one relates to oneself and the world. It is about learning to face pain rather than run from it, to embrace the full spectrum of human emotions, and to find a sense of purpose that makes life meaningful. Addiction is not the end of the road. It can be the beginning of a profound journey toward self-discovery and wholeness. The concept of addiction often revolves around the idea of breaking free from destructive behaviors. But true healing goes beyond simply ceasing the addictive action. The real goal of recovery is not just abstinence, but the achievement of wholeness and the fulfillment of one's deeper psychological and emotional needs. Carl Jung and Gabor Maté both suggest that addiction is a symptom of a greater issue, a disconnect from the self, and a lack of meaningful engagement with life. Moving beyond addiction, therefore, is not about returning to a baseline state of normalcy, but rather stepping into a more complete and authentic version of oneself. Jung's work on the process of individuation offers a profound understanding of how to move beyond addiction. Individuation, according to Jung, is the process of integrating the unconscious with the conscious mind, the repressed aspects of the self with the acknowledged, and the contradictions within one's psyche into a cohesive whole. In the context of addiction, this means that individuals who are struggling with addiction must confront the parts of themselves that they have been avoiding, repressing, or disowning. These parts are often the root causes of addiction: the unaddressed trauma, the denied emotions, the fears, and the unmet needs. The addictive behavior serves as a form of escape, a way to avoid confronting these unresolved issues. Therefore, the path to recovery involves not just stopping the addiction, but a deep journey into the self. A journey that allows the individual to face their inner darkness, accept it, and transform it. Jung believed that the way to transcend addiction was through the realization of the self, the central, unifying archetype in the human psyche. The self, for Jung, is not just the ego, but the totality of the person, including both conscious and unconscious aspects. Addiction can be seen as a fragmentation of the self, where the individual loses touch with their true identity and purpose. When someone is stuck in the cycle of addiction, they are often lost in an artificial version of themselves, one defined by compulsive behaviors and numbing substances. Moving beyond addiction, then, is a process of reconnecting with the authentic self, a process that requires not just stopping the addiction, but cultivating an awareness of who one truly is beyond the compulsive behavior. This requires introspection, self-exploration, and a willingness to engage with uncomfortable emotions. For Jung, the path to healing was not linear or easy. It involved confronting the shadow, the parts of the self that we are not aware of, the parts that we try to suppress or deny. Addiction often arises from these very places: the unresolved pain, the unacknowledged desires, the feelings of inadequacy or shame. By integrating the shadow, a person can move beyond the addiction because they are no longer trying to escape from themselves. The self is no longer fragmented or split into parts that are in constant conflict. Instead, there is harmony, an acceptance of both light and dark aspects of the self, and a deeper understanding of the forces that drive behavior. This integrated self can then create a more meaningful and authentic life, one that is not governed by compulsive need for substances or behaviors. For Gabor Maté, moving beyond addiction involves understanding the deeper emotional wounds that drive compulsive behaviors and addressing the root causes of those wounds. Maté's approach focuses on the belief that addiction is an attempt to soothe emotional pain that cannot be processed in healthier ways. Addiction is a way to manage overwhelming feelings of loneliness, fear, anxiety, and trauma. But healing requires confronting these feelings directly, rather than numbing them. As Maté emphasizes, recovery involves reparenting oneself, learning to nurture, care for, and validate oneself in the way that might not have been experienced during childhood. The goal is not simply to stop the behavior, but to replace it with healthier coping mechanisms and a more profound sense of emotional well-being. Maté suggests that the healing process is deeply relational. Recovery cannot occur in isolation, as the wound of addiction often stems from a lack of connection in the first place. Whether it is due to childhood neglect, abuse, or emotional distance, addiction is often rooted in feelings of abandonment or disconnection. The way forward, then, is through connection to others, to the self, and to something greater than oneself. Supportive relationships are essential in healing from addiction because they help individuals build new frameworks for emotional regulation and self-worth. Group therapy, peer support, and deep friendships can all provide the sense of belonging and validation that many addicts desperately crave. The healing process also involves building trust and learning to be vulnerable in relationships, breaking the isolation that addiction creates. Maté also speaks to the importance of self-compassion in the process of recovery. He highlights how addicts often internalize a sense of shame and self-blame, which only compounds their suffering. In many cases, this shame is tied to a belief that addiction is a moral failing or personal weakness. Overcoming this shame requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Rather than seeing addiction as a weakness, Maté encourages individuals to view it as a coping mechanism, a natural response to an unnatural set of circumstances. Recovery, then, is not about punishment or willpower, but about understanding, forgiveness, and compassion. The person struggling with addiction must learn to treat themselves with the kindness and care they might have lacked during their formative years. This self-compassion is not indulgence, but the foundation for healing. For many people, moving beyond addiction involves a spiritual awakening, a reconnection to something larger than themselves. Both Jung and Maté recognize that healing from addiction often involves tapping into a deeper sense of purpose and meaning. For Jung, this meant connecting to the self, a realization of the deep potential and inner wisdom that resides in every individual. For Maté, it can mean recognizing that addiction is not just an individual problem, but a societal issue. And healing can occur when individuals come together and support one another in a shared journey. Both approaches recognize that true fulfillment cannot be found through external substances or behaviors, but through inner transformation and connection to the greater whole. Ultimately, moving beyond addiction means reimagining life. When addiction has been a constant source of comfort, security, and distraction, it can feel like a loss when it is removed. The space left by addiction can feel empty, and many individuals in recovery experience what is known as a void. The challenge, then, is not just to stop the addictive behavior, but to find new sources of joy, fulfillment, and purpose that can fill that space. This is where creativity, self-expression, relationships, and personal growth come in. Finding new passions, setting new goals, and discovering new ways to experience joy are all part of the process of moving beyond addiction. Moving beyond addiction is not a linear process, and it does not happen overnight. It is an ongoing journey of self-discovery, self-compassion, and spiritual growth. The person who has faced the darkness of addiction and emerged on the other side is often more resilient, more self-aware, and more connected to their true purpose. Recovery is not just the end of a harmful behavior, but the beginning of a deeper, more authentic life. A life where the person can embrace their full humanity, learn from their past, and create a future filled with meaning and possibility.